Everyone in the lobby heard the elevator chime, but only Maya noticed the silence that followed, as if the building took a breath it didn't want to exhale. The morning was choreography. Heels tapping in time, a revolving door slicing the city into neat, obedient wedges, the glass-walled mezzanine holding its reflections like secrets. She clutched the pass on her lanyard and pretended she was not counting her own heartbeats. 3 months into the internship, she had learned the invisible rules. Don't stare at the art, don't touch the marble, and never, ever draw attention. Then a man stepped out of the elevator with a question on his mouth that didn't have sound. He paused, scanning the direction board, blinking at the scrolling letters. His hands trembled in small, controlled arcs. He wore a suit the color of dusk, and his face was, Maya felt this before she named it, tired in a tender way, like someone who had crossed a quiet ocean alone. The receptionist launched into a practiced greeting. He smiled in apology, lifted a hand and shook his head. The air around him thinned, not with embarrassment, but with distance, the kind that happens when a language leaves the room and no one knows how to call it back. Maya's palm warmed. She felt it the way musicians feel the stage before their first note. She stepped forward, careful, unsure if she was about to make a mistake that would swallow the rest of her day. She let the receptionist's words fade and placed herself in the man's line of sight, a small act of courage wearing simple clothes. Then she raised her hands, and the silence opened like a window. "Hello. Can I help you?" The man's eyes lit the way people's eyes do when you pronounce their name correctly. He signed back, slow and precise. "Meeting, 15th floor. Late. Where is check-in?" She nodded. Her muscles remembered what her grief had taught them long before the internship. How to listen with hands, how to speak with sky and wrists and fingertips. She shaped the answer. "I can check you in. Come with me." He exhaled, the kind of breath that leaves a room brighter than it found it. Somewhere above them, a figure paused at the mezzanine railing, the glass frosting slightly with the cool of the conditioned air. His suit was midnight, his tie the color of common sense. Anyone else might have missed him. He watched as Maya guided the guest to the tablet, typed his name, waited for the green tick, and then lifted her hands again, not as performance, not as pity, but as a bridge she knew how to build. The guest's relief was a soft thing, like a candle in a window telling travelers there was a kitchen inside and it was warm. If the city had words for the way her throat tightened, it would have used them. Instead, it gave her light. It poured it through the atrium so it broke on her shoulders, turned her hair to ink and honey, caught the curve of her cheekbone as she smiled, patient and open, to an entire language most people walk past. The mezzanine watcher saw the receptionist take a step back, first with surprise, then with the kind of humility that looks like a cough into a sleeve, and he filed the detail away in the part of his mind that catalogues reasons to change things. "You're early," the receptionist said reflexively, as if her voice wanted to leave a fingerprint. Maya ignored it gently. She finished the check-in, clipped the guest badge, and handed it over. "This way," she signed, and the man nodded. He made a grateful motion that landed somewhere between "thank you" and "you didn't have to," and then the elevator opened as if it had been waiting for these exact hands to call it. Inside the elevator, the world softened. The doors slid shut on the lobby's white noise and sealed them into a small room where a soft hum stood in for conversation. The guest sighed. He touched his chest, then lifted a hand, asking her name. "Maya," she signed. "And you?" "Anton." She repeated his name with careful fingers. He smiled. They rose through floors of glass and concrete and ambition. 15 lit up. As the numbers blinked in their precise ascent, Maya felt her pulse settle, the way the sea settles after making a point. When the doors opened, the hallway wore that clinical serenity expensive offices curate. Soundproofed doors, art that suggested oceans without admitting to water, a carpet so thick people seemed to walk on a secret. A meeting assistant in understated black appeared and beamed. "We were just waiting on Mr. Anton." "Great." She reached for his hand with a burst of brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Maya stepped in, not as a savior, not as a hero, just as the person who could turn a door handle others had overlooked. "He is here," she signed beside her words to Anton. "This is the meeting. They're ready." The assistant's eyebrows rose. "Oh, do you sign? That's convenient." Maya nodded. Convenient was one word. Another word was necessary. Another was right. The assistant hesitated just long enough for the moment to wobble. Then she recovered and ushered Anton inside. Maya hovered, a ghost at the threshold, eyes adjusting to the glossy conference table, the precise water glasses, the screen glowing softly with a paused slide. The meeting murmurs dissolved into a curious hush. Faces pivoted. A man with hair like thoughtful steel offered a practiced smile. "Welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming." Anton looked to Maya. She translated in the air, a quiet duet of meaning. A few people exchanged glances, interest, relief, the private scramble of minds trying to remember whether the accessibility line in the deck had been there because they believed it, or because it photographed well. From the far end of the table, a man cleared his throat. He wore no bravado, and it was almost startling. No cufflinks shaped like decisions, no watch heavy enough to make a point, just a trimmed beard, a shirt that fit like honest work, and eyes that took in a room the way rivers take their time. Curious, thorough, certain of gravity. He leaned forward, not to dominate, but to listen better. He said his name, and the room did the thing rooms do when the person who can end them or save them starts speaking. "Ethan Hale." "Thank you for being here, Anton." Maya did not translate that sound to hands. She had seen the name on the lobby wall in letters that believed they were permanent. She was translating the next sentence before she realized she'd begun. Anton watched her hands the way one watches a steady horizon. "We invited you because you see what we don't. We pay attention to the market. You pay attention to people. Help us renovate our attention." Maya's hands slowed. The language hung in the air like a mobile, balanced, generous. Ethan Hale's eyes flicked to her briefly before returning to Anton. The moment was a pebble in a lake. The ripples would circle out later, hit unexpected shores. For now, the surface held. They began. Someone adjusted the blinds. Someone whispered a correction into a colleague's ear. Slides advanced. Questions landed and were answered in hands and voice, a braid of communication the room learned to respect in real time. When Maya translated a joke and the table laughed together, a quiet joy stood up and stretched its legs. When she changed her stance, Anton mirrored her unconsciously, settling deeper into the seat, the way one does when the chair finally fits. Halfway through, The assistant brought coffee. She placed a cup near Maya's elbow with a glance that held apology and gratitude, and something like resentment's distant cousin. Maya thanked her with a nod and folded her fingers under the table to keep them from trembling. She had told herself she would put her brother's hands to good use in this life, even if it was only small kindnesses at bus stops, simple gestures at grocery store counters, little ways to make silence feel less like exile. She had not expected her brother's language to walk into a boardroom like sunlight. Across the glass, Ethan watched. Not the way men watch when they count, or the way executives watch when they calculate. He watched like a person paying attention to life. He watched the decency of it, the care with which Maya waited for Anton's cue, the humility of letting silence have its turn. He watched the room's posture change, the shallow bias that had arrived with its briefcase gradually losing its grip. He made a note he did not write down. Promote what is truly listening, not just what performs it. When the strategy director pressed a question that sounded like a verdict, Maya lifted her hands and softened it. She had learned that good translation is honest and gentle at once. Anton responded with a story instead of an argument. A bakery in his neighborhood, run by a woman who can lip-read from across a crowded Sunday. How she recognized regulars by the rhythm of their eyebrows. How she turned a counter into a small kingdom where everyone was seen. He said the market wants to be seen. He said people give their best to places that do not ask them to disappear first. Maya shaped the words mid-air. They felt like balm. She saw the way they landed in the team's shoulders, lowered, loosened. The strategy director's pen stopped clicking. The finance lead recrossed his legs as if he had remembered he had them. When the meeting ended, the room glowed the way rivers do when the sun chooses them. They rose, shook hands, exchanged cards. "Thank you," someone said to Anton. "We'll be in touch soon." "Thank you," someone said to Maya. "That was really helpful." The assistant squeezed Maya's elbow in what might have been an apology or an alliance. The door opened to the hallway, and the world resumed its original speed. Maya guided Anton back to the elevator, her hands light with the pleasant ache of being useful. He signed, "Thank you again," and she replied, "It was my honor." He hesitated, then signed, "Please tell your manager I appreciate your help. They should know." She smiled. "I will." The doors slid shut, and his reflection merged with hers in the stainless steel, two figures cut out of the same quiet. When they opened on the lobby, the air felt cooler, or maybe she did. She returned the visitor iPad to its cradle, smiled at the receptionist, who suddenly looked like she was thinking, and reached for the small notebook she kept in her blazer pocket. She had learned to write thoughts down before the world talked her out of them. "Don't overstep," a voice snapped. The supervisor's heels were the sound a warning makes when it wants to be mistaken for style. She materialized from nothing, carrying a tablet like a verdict. "You're assigned to social listening, not concierge. If someone needs assistance, security or reception handles it. We don't create dependencies. It's inefficient." Maya swallowed. "He was lost," she said softly. "Reception couldn't—" "You're not a fixer, Maya. It confuses expectations. We can't have interns improvising." A silence settled, a different kind than before, thick and scratchy. The receptionist looked down at her keyboard as if it had suddenly begun to sing. The security guard checked a camera feed with rapt interest. There was a taste of static in the air. Maya felt the old, unwelcome heat crawl up her neck. "Don't shrink," she told herself. "Don't go small." She thought of the bakery story, and of Jesse laughing in a winter hat too big for him, learning his first sign with fierce concentration. More. She said nothing. She couldn't trust her voice to be a bridge and not a match. From the mezzanine, motion. An almost imperceptible nod to a man in a charcoal suit standing a step behind the supervisor. A man with a face like a calendar reminder. He leaned forward. "Ms. Green," he murmured. "Mr. Hale is requesting you upstairs." The supervisor's head tilted in a practiced imitation of curiosity. "Now?" "Now." She masked her irritation with a smile that had teeth in it, then cut a look at Maya that promised a later conversation. "We'll finish this," she said. "Don't move." Maya moved. She moved a breath inward, away from the shame tightening her ribs, into a calmer room inside herself where Jesse still laughed. She counted to 5 in their old secret way, thumb to fingertip, small to large. When she looked up, the mezzanine glass was holding a figure like a captured star. For a heartbeat, his gaze met hers through the reflections. She didn't know his name. She only knew those eyes had watched her say hello to silence and had approved. The supervisor disappeared into the elevator. The lobby exhaled. The receptionist muttered, "That was unfair," in a voice too small to help and too honest to dismiss. Maya nodded and kept her face steady. Relief and tremor braided under her skin. She returned to the small workstation at the side of the atrium and lifted the headset she wore when monitoring brand sentiment, the modern act of listening to a million voices and trying to hear the human in them. The dashboard blinked awake. Charts like city skylines, words like weather. Her phone pulsed with a text from her aunt. "How is the big world today? Do they know how lucky they are to have you?" Maya smiled and typed, "Today, the world said hello back." She put the phone away. She let herself breathe with her shoulders. The mezzanine observer was gone, or perhaps he had simply learned how to be part of the glass again. She sipped her coffee, which had cooled into a cousin of itself, and turned to the dashboard just as the red line of sentiment flattened into a cautious optimism. She liked to imagine the lines were heartbeats. It made the work feel less like weather and more like medicine. If you, reading this line with your own quiet breath, felt the small glow that comes from seeing someone be seen, leave a gentle sign of it, a heart, a whisper of a comment, a soft subscribe, so the story finds its way to others who need a little light. It's a humble ritual, almost like passing bread. It tells the room that someone is listening, and sometimes that is how a soul remembers to heal. The elevator chimed again. Ethan Hale emerged with a handful of meetings behind his eyes. He spoke to no one at first, as if words were currency, and he was careful with what he spent. Then he adjusted course and walked toward the small workstation where Maya sat. He did not look like a myth. He looked like a man who knew where the exits were and had chosen not to use them. "Maya," he said. Her name in his mouth landed like a warm coat across cold shoulders. She stood too quickly and managed not to knock anything over. "Yes? I'm Ethan," he said, as if the marble had not already introduced him every day. "I watched you help our guest this morning. That was the exact kind of initiative that should be ordinary and rarely is. Thank you." Her chest loosened. "Of course. I'd like you to be on the afternoon session, if you're free. We want him comfortable. We want to be better than we were yesterday." The words entered her like the first day of spring. She nodded. "I'm free," Good. He glanced at the mezzanine, then back at her. And if anyone suggests you overstepped, send them to me. Sir, she began, because she had learned the grammar of power. I don't want to cause... You won't, he said evenly. You helped. We measure what matters. A faint smile. And I'm learning that sometimes the shortest path to a solution is not a line on a graph, but a pair of hands that knows how to say hello. He left her with a time and a room number. As he turned away, she almost called after him to explain about Jessie, about late-night practice, about how she had promised the world she would never let a door be a wall if she could help it. But some truths travel better when carried by action, and she had work to do. When he stepped onto the mezzanine again, he paused. He looked down at the lobby, at the river of shoes and schedules, at the security badges catching the light, at the receptionist who now watched Maya as if learning a new language, at the intern who had turned a complicated morning into something simple and human. He wondered how many good days had been waiting on the other side of a word like convenient. He wondered how to build an architecture that left less of life on the cutting room floor. Maya returned to her dashboard. She practiced her breath the way some people sharpen knives. 5 in, 5 out. She scanned sentiment and headlines and the wry remarks of strangers who pretend they aren't aching. She answered what she could in the brand voice and saved what mattered for the afternoon's meeting. When the clock turned its small face toward 1, she brushed a thumb over the denim seam inside her blazer where Jessie's old ribbon lived, tucked and steady. The second session would be longer. The room would be different. She would not be invisible, not after this morning. Visibility is a tender thing when you are still learning how to belong and not apologize for it. She packed her courage with her notebook and stood. The atrium's light followed her to the elevator. She pressed 15 with a finger that didn't shake. The doors slid shut like a promise. She did not know the supervisor was on her way back down, spine stiff with new instructions and old habits. She did not know that Anton had messaged his team about the morning, or that the receptionist had opened a browser tab to finger-spell videos. She did not know that Ethan had added a line to the afternoon agenda, "Listen to how we listen." She only knew her hands, her breath, the thread that led her upstairs like a song someone had written before she was born and left in the world for her to find. The elevator rose. Somewhere above, a table waited. Somewhere between, the air held its breath again, as if something gentle but decisive was about to enter the room and ask everything to soften. And when the doors opened, Maya stepped out, the future curling at the edges like paper near a candle, ready to be shaped by the heat of the next word. The conference room carried an aftertaste of intensity, as though the words spoken there lingered in the walls, waiting to be recalled at the next negotiation. Maya sat near the edge, her notebook balanced across her knees, translating Anton's thoughts with a quiet rhythm that made silence itself feel whole. The session had stretched longer than expected, and fatigue was beginning to trace its lines across everyone's posture, yet the energy around the table stayed alive, pulled forward by the delicate bridge Maya created with her hands. Every flick of her wrist, every careful shaping of words seemed to braid understanding from two worlds that otherwise might have only nodded politely and moved past one another. Ethan's presence at the head of the table was steady, the kind of steadiness that softened without losing strength. His gaze returned often to Maya, not in the hungry way of men who wish to possess, but in the quiet study of someone who was beginning to realize the rare gift of seeing humanity expressed through another person's courage. He listened as Anton described markets, communities, and the subtle dance between inclusion and authenticity, but in truth his attention was half-tethered to the movements of Maya's fingers, to the gentle current that flowed through her translation. It was in the pauses that she revealed the most, her breath filling the silence, her eyes waiting on Anton's nod, her small smile when a concept found its home in another language. Healing seemed to radiate from her, not just for Anton, but for the room itself, as though she had been sent there to remind them that communication was more than data and decisions. It was compassion made visible. When the session adjourned for a brief recess, people rose and scattered to the hallway for coffee, their voices eager for lighter conversation. Maya collected her notebook slowly, her hands a little stiff from hours of motion, but her spirit carried a warmth that refused to dim. She lingered at the window, where the city stretched below like a restless ocean of glass and traffic, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The sunlight slanted in, painting her silhouette with the kind of glow that makes a person look untouchable, even though inside she still wrestled with self-doubt. "Good work." She turned. Ethan stood a few steps away, a coffee cup in one hand, his other hand resting loosely at his side as if he had nowhere else to be. His voice had shed the formality of the boardroom, carrying something gentler, almost private. "Thank you," Maya said softly. She did not add that it was less work and more instinct, less skill, and more a promise kept to someone she could no longer see. "You didn't just translate words," Ethan continued, his eyes steady on her. "You made people listen differently. That's rare." Maya lowered her gaze, a blush warming her cheeks. "I only tried to make sure nothing was lost." "Nothing was lost," he agreed, "but something was found." The words settled between them with the kind of weight that heals instead of crushes. She lifted her eyes and met his, and for a long moment it was as if the city vanished beyond the glass. There was only the room, the faint hum of machines, and the strange certainty that sometimes recognition comes not from effort, but from being truly seen. When the recess ended, Ethan surprised her by walking beside her into the room. He made no announcement, no gesture of superiority, simply fell into step as though they had always shared that corridor. Inside, the second half of the session unfolded with more ease. Anton's laughter came quicker, the executives seemed less guarded, and Maya felt her own tension melt. She could feel the energy of healing seeping into the space, as though kindness had found its rightful place at the table. Near the end, when a question turned sharp and defensive, Maya translated it with care, softening the edges just enough to preserve respect without losing truth. Anton responded with grace, and Ethan's eyes found hers again, gratitude unspoken but palpable. By the close, Ethan rose and thanked everyone, his voice carrying a conviction that wrapped the session in dignity. Then, to Maya's astonishment, he acknowledged her by name. "And thank you to Maya for ensuring that our conversation was not just heard, but understood." The room applauded lightly, polite but genuine. Maya felt her throat tighten. She managed a nod, her hands trembling against her notebook. Recognition was not what she had come for, yet its warmth was undeniable, like sunlight reaching a place she had always kept in shadow. When they filed out, Ethan caught her glance once more and gave a small nod, the kind that carried meaning beyond words. "I see you. I value you. don't shrink from this moment. Maya carried that silent message with her down the hallway, her steps lighter, her heart steadying into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. She thought of Jesse, of his small hands forming the word hope with fierce determination, and for the first time in months she felt as though hope had answered back. The day was not over. More meetings, more tasks awaited. But as Maya returned to her desk, the hum of the atrium felt different, almost melodic. The glass walls no longer reflected her invisibility, but her presence. She settled into her chair with quiet resolve, unaware that the seeds planted in that conference room would grow into something that would change both her life and Ethan's. The story was only beginning to unfold, carrying them both toward moments of challenge, tenderness, and the kind of connection that heals in ways no one anticipates. And as the elevator doors closed once more on Ethan heading upstairs, Maya allowed herself the smallest smile, sensing without knowing why that this was not the last time his eyes would find hers when silence needed a voice. The days that followed rearranged themselves around a simple fact. Whenever Anton was in the building, Maya was in the room, and wherever Maya was in the room, Ethan's attention learned a new path. What began as a courtesy, keep him comfortable, make sure nothing is lost, became a quiet rhythm that pulled them into the same orbit. Schedules bent. Hallways remembered the sound of their footsteps together. The elevator, that small silver confessional, learned the shape of their silence, the good kind that rests, not the heavy kind that hides. Mornings were built out of glass and coffee. The city's light arrived early and generous, draping itself over the atrium, making everything look slightly kinder than the day before. Maya began to measure time in small tendernesses, the way Anton's shoulders unclenched as she signed good morning, the way the receptionist, now practicing finger spelling at her station, lifted an eager hand to try hello, the way Ethan's voice softened on certain words when he knew she'd be turning them into motion. She discovered that healing, once it enters a room, refuses to behave like a guest. It moves furniture. It lowers hard voices. It sets out water for the weary. The second week brought deadlines that clattered like dishes. There were mock-ups to review, a pilot event to design, a sponsorship deal to rescue from a death by spreadsheets. The project became an intricate bridge between two worlds, and Maya found herself standing at the center span, every day a new test of balance. She translated in meetings, yes, but she also caught the meaning slipping through the cracks, the impatience that wasn't cruelty so much as fear of being late, the eagerness that tripped over itself and tangled in someone else's boundaries, the easy joke that needed a gentler landing. She translated those two, with her eyes and her posture, and the pauses she protected as if they were living things. Ethan noticed. He noticed the way she timed a joke so that Anton could see the smile arrive with the punchline, the kindness of giving laughter a face. He noticed the way she leaned forward when the conversation asked too much of a person's courage. He noticed how the entire room changed temperature when she took a breath and signed with deliberate care. And he noticed something else, something that made him unexpectedly shy, the way relief looked on her, like summer after a stubborn winter. He found himself wanting to make spaces where that relief could live. Forced proximity is a polite term for the way a building corrals two lives into the same corridor, the same calendar blocks, the same decisions. Maya felt it in the small practicalities. Ethan walking beside her to the conference room, asking whether the seating had sightlines clear enough for Anton to read the room. Ethan pausing at the coffee station, asking whether the captions on their internal videos needed a new standard. Ethan waiting after a meeting to ask whether they had protected the silence well enough today, whether anyone had rushed past, meaning each question revealed a man who owned the building but wanted to earn the room. She wanted to stand farther away from him. She kept failing. Kindness has a gravity. So does attention free of agenda. In the elevator, one late afternoon, after a session that had rolled over the lunch hour and collapsed on the far side of 3, they stood without speaking. He leaned on the railing with a tired grace, that rare posture executives often forget they're allowed, the permission to be human in public. She held her badge between forefinger and thumb and traced its edge as if smoothing a nervous thought. Their reflections stood beside them like witnesses who had promised not to gossip. "Do you eat?" he asked at last. It should have been mundane. It felt like an invitation to breathe. She smiled. "Sometimes I forget." "Don't," he said. "The work is better when the body is a friend." The doors opened on 12 for someone else. They waited, then closed again. He added quietly, "We're doing something that asks people to trust us. That kind of work uses more of a person than the job description mentions." "I'm learning," she said. She didn't say that she had learned this once the hard way, in a hospital that smelled like lemons and loss, when her body forgot how to be a friend and grief taught it again. On 15, the doors slid open to the hush of the hallway. He made no move to precede her. They walked side by side. By the middle of the month, the project had become a small movement. Reception had a laminated card with common signs. Facilities had installed better sightline monitors in the largest conference rooms. IT had added a line in their ticketing system, accessibility priority, and someone had drawn a tiny heart next to it with a black pen. No one mentioned Maya's name when these things appeared, and it was better that way. Good change pretends it has always belonged. Her supervisor, however, kept her ledger. There were emails with subject lines that cleared their throat. There were performance notes that smiled with their teeth, praising initiative while advising adherence to scope. There were meetings that felt like being graded for kindness. Maya endured them with the patience of a person who knows a storm when she hears one, but also knows that weather passes and a self must remain. One afternoon, the ledger blossomed into a meeting with HR. The room was beige and careful. They asked her whether she felt supported. They asked whether she understood boundaries. They asked whether she had been promised any promotions or favors as a result of her work with the CEO. She realized then how rumors prefer lazy routes. She sat very still and let her hands fold quietly on the table, a posture she'd learned from Jesse when he was determined to be brave. "I was asked to help," she said evenly. "I'm helping." "And Mr. Hale?" the HR rep asked, pen poised like a small spear. "He's listening," Maya said, because that was the only sentence that felt true enough to keep her from resentment. The meeting dispersed with the odd solemnity of a play that had forgotten its ending. In the hallway, she paused by the window and let the city hold her. Healing, she knew, was not a single act, but a sequence. Today, it would be a cup of water, 5 slow breaths, a call to her aunt. Tomorrow, it might be laughter. Next week, it might be refusing a false apology. She pressed her palm to the glass and then let it go. When she returned to the atrium, Ethan was waiting near her workstation. He didn't lean on anything. He didn't pace. He stood with the stillness of someone who understands that other people's edges are not his to push. "Walk with me?" he asked. They took the long path around the mezzanine, where the glass turned the city into a mosaic and their reflections into watercolor. He told her, in that measured tone he used when he wanted truth to land softly, that he'd heard about the meeting. He asked if she was all right. Something in his face tightened at the thought that she might not be. "I'm fine," she said. "They're learning." "If anyone treats you as leverage," he said, "I'll remove them from the room where decisions are made." She didn't know what to do with the way her chest warmed at that. She looked at the city to distract the part of her heart that wanted to live in his pocket. "That's not necessary," she said. "Just make the rooms kinder." "That is necessary," he said. "And we're doing it." He paused, then added softer, "You're doing it." They walked past a wall of portraits, founders, benefactors, a rehearsal of gratitude in silver frames. He stopped at an empty space where another frame would one day live and said, almost to himself, "We'll make a new tradition here. We honor the invisible work that makes all the visible work possible." She looked at him, surprised by how much she wanted to believe him. "Invisible work doesn't usually get plaques." "Then we'll invent a better system." She laughed, and the sound lifted something inside him he hadn't realized was heavy. The forced proximity became real chemistry in moments that seemed invented by chance. In the copy room at dusk, where the machines hummed like patient animals and the paper smelled faintly of rain, she reached for a ream at the same time he did. Their fingers brushed. She startled like a sparrow, then steadied like a tree. He stepped back as if the gravity between them could be trusted to do its own work. "Sorry," he said. "For what?" she teased. "Sharing a universe?" He smiled. He was not a man given to extravagance, yet his smile felt like opening a window, for making a simple errand feel like poetry. Another day, the fire alarm hiccuped them all into the stairwell for a drill that no one had the patience for, but everyone obeyed. They wound down the concrete spiral with 1,000 small annoyances, inconvenient deadlines, coffees abandoned, slides unsaved. Somewhere between floors, Anton ended up a few steps behind them, and Maya turned to sign a joke about the stairwell's acoustics. Ethan watched the quick dance of her hands against the grey, the way light found her wrists and made of them something luminous. He felt that unreasonable gratitude again, as if he had been allowed to witness a private ritual that nevertheless wanted the world better. On the ground floor, the drill dissolved into laughter and relief. The building shook off its false emergency and resumed the business of sheltering ambition. Ethan touched Maya's elbow, not to claim her path, but to ask for it. "Do you have 5 minutes?" he asked. "I'd like your eyes on something." He led her to a small conference room where an early version of a policy sat on the screen. It was heavy with good intentions and the stiffness of legal fear. He asked her to read it with him. He asked questions with the humility of a student. Does this assume too much? Where is the hidden bias? Are we asking the right people for advice? She gave answers the way a person gives water to a traveler. No flourish, just the grace of meeting need. When she suggested language that made humans more visible than departments, he edited it in, then sat back and said, "Yes," as if truth had finally dragged a chair to the table. "How did you learn to listen like this?" she asked, not accusing, genuinely curious. "Someone once translated my hurry back to me," he said. "I realized it sounded like harm. I've been learning to slow down ever since." She waited. "My father worked with numbers the way some men fish," he said. "Patiently, obsessively. He thought silence was virtue and that words were expensive. My mother was a nurse who counted life in breaths and hands held. When she died, my father stopped speaking entirely for a while. The numbers were loyal, though. They never asked for a tone of voice." He glanced at her. "I took after him for a long time. It's easier to be right than to be kind when you forget the difference." "And now?" she asked gently. "Now I practice failing quickly at being perfect," he said, the joke covering the confession. "And try again at being present." The room felt full of something like forgiveness. She nodded, letting the story settle beside hers. Two people learning how to stay. Evenings grew longer as the launch approached. The building at night is a tender animal, soothed by the absence of urgency. The atrium light dimmed into a kind of dusk. The glass turned gentle, and the city beyond looked like a prayer whispered to itself. They worked in the soft cocoon of almost quiet. Maya on drafts and sign notes, Ethan on budgets and calls that needed a human voice at the end of them. Anton, warm with gratitude, brought food no one had asked for and left with the kind of smile that refuses to be fragile. One night, a storm shouldered the windows. Rain wrote its own hurried language on the glass. The hallway lights reflected in the puddles like constellations relocated to Earth. Maya rubbed her wrist where a dull ache had begun to complain. Ethan looked up from a spreadsheet that had forgotten what it was for and said, "We should stop." "We're close," she said. "One more pass." "You're more important than the pass," he said. "So is your wrist." She flexed her fingers, tested the soft ache, and conceded, "It will forgive me in the morning." He closed his laptop, the rare, decisive click of a man who had learned which interrupts were sacred. "Let me see," he asked, a question to her consent rather than her body, and when she nodded, he came around the table and took her hand in both of his, careful as if it were something that remembered pain. He pressed his thumb along the muscle, a slow, considerate pressure, as if conversation could be made of bones and blood as easily as words and hands. Heat moved through her like understanding. "Better?" he asked. "Better?" she whispered, the word loosening something that had held a quiet tremor all day. Healing made a small nest in the moment and refused to leave. Lightning stitched the sky. The room softened, the way rooms do when two people finally allow themselves to be sincere in the same place at the same time. He released her hand, and the absence didn't feel like a loss, only a pause with its own kind of promise. They stood, gathered their things, and walked to the elevator in a companionship that didn't rush to label itself. In the descending car, he said without calculation, "I'm learning a few signs. Slowly. Badly." Her smile felt like yes. "You can be slow," she said. "You can be bad. The only mistake is thinking sound is the only way to be heard." "Teach me one now?" he asked. She lifted her free hand and shaped the sign for thank you, a small generosity offered from mouth to air to heart. He mirrored it, halting but careful. The gesture looked good on him, dignified, honest. "Again," he said, and did it once more. "Better." When the doors opened on the lobby, the world returned like a tide. Security nodded. The receptionist waved. The storm slackened into a patient drizzle. He walked her to the door, not to own the moment, but to honor it. And there on the threshold, where inside and outside shake hands, he said, "Tomorrow, let's rearrange the agenda so we open with the story and not the metrics. It will make the room braver." She thought of the bakery Anton had described, of counters turned into kingdoms, of people practiced in the art of not disappearing. "Yes," she said, "let's do that." He held the door. Night breathed in. She stepped into it. The city's rain made a soft drum of the street, its rhythm the oldest kind of lullaby, the one that tells the body it is allowed to rest. She turned once, and he was still there, a tall figure framed by light, a silhouette that looked like the idea of home one makes before one has ever found it. She walked away, not to escape, but to carry the warmth forward. The future felt like a hand extended in welcome. Tomorrow would ask for more of them. Tonight had offered something steady in return. Somewhere above her, the windows of the building held their small constellations. Somewhere inside, a man was practicing a sign, awkward and sincere, until it resembled a prayer. And in the morning, when the city woke with its usual appetite for hurry, they would meet again in the rooms where meaning is easily misplaced, and decide together to put it back where it belongs, between hearts, at eye level, in a language that does not require sound to be true. The forced proximity had done its work. The chemistry had learned its name. What came next would ask for a deeper kind of courage, a language beyond sound, a lesson she knew with her bones, and he was just beginning to learn. Afternoons stretched into something gentler than work, though the schedules were merciless and the meetings left little air. Maya found herself teaching Ethan small signs in the quiet minutes before presentations began, when the room was still half empty and the table scattered with untouched water glasses. His fingers were clumsy, but his concentration was unwavering. She showed him how to form understand, how to shape listen, how to soften the gesture for thank you. Each time, he practiced until it looked less like an imitation and more like sincerity finding its shape. The act of learning together carried a healing rhythm. It told her that language could be a gift instead of a barrier, and told him that patience could feel like intimacy. There were days when exhaustion clung to her like a shadow, yet even then, Ethan's presence was grounding. He had the habit of noticing without intruding, offering her a chair when her knees trembled after hours of standing, slowing his voice so her hands could move without rush, cutting through the noise of boardroom politics by saying, "Let's wait until everyone has been heard." These gestures seemed small in a building addicted to speed, but to Maya they were lifelines, tiny affirmations that reminded her the world could still choose kindness. Their bond deepened not in grand declarations, but in details. The way he brought her tea one morning, saying simply, "This tastes like calm." The way she left him a note with Jessie's favorite quote, "To listen is to love without interruption," and found it folded carefully in his planner days later. These fragments stitched themselves into something neither of them named, though both carried it like warmth in their pockets. The supervisor's disapproval did not vanish. Instead, it thickened, turning into whispered reports and veiled comments about boundaries. Yet each time Maya feared she had overstepped, Ethan steadied her with a look that said, "Stay. You belong here." That gaze held more power than any written policy, more promise than any official defense. And slowly she began to believe it. Healing often arrives in places where one expects resistance, and she realized she was healing not only for herself, but for Jessie, whose absence still pressed against her in quiet hours. One evening, as the office emptied into the hum of the city, Ethan asked her to walk through a new community space the company was planning, a place meant for gathering, designed with accessibility in mind. They moved between unfinished walls, dust rising in the air, and he spoke of benches arranged for open sightlines, of lighting soft enough for eyes that tire easily, of doors that did not ask too much of fragile hands. Maya listened, her heart swelling with recognition. She showed him the sign for future, and he repeated it back to her beneath the raw beams, his eyes steady, as if promising he would build this word into something real. In that half-lit room, surrounded by scaffolding and echoes, Maya felt the quiet shift between them. The line between professional duty and something softer had blurred, not with haste, but with trust. She saw not a CEO, but a man learning to listen, and he saw not an intern, but a woman carrying light into spaces that had forgotten how to honor it. They left the room side by side, the city's dusk waiting for them beyond the glass doors. The air was cool, tinged with rain, carrying the scent of beginnings. As they stepped outside, Maya realized that the distance between them was no longer defined by silence or titles. It was a distance ready to be crossed, gently, with patience, with a language that asked only for honesty. And with that understanding, their story moved forward, carrying them toward challenges neither of them could yet name, but also toward the quiet certainty that healing had already chosen them and would not leave. The weeks unfolded with a rhythm that seemed ordinary to everyone else, but felt extraordinary to Maya. What had started as small gestures, an offered cup of tea, a hand lifted in a new sign, had become the quiet foundation of days that seemed less heavy. Healing, she realized, was not one dramatic moment of transformation, but a series of small mercies strung together like beads on a hidden necklace. Ethan kept offering them without fanfare, and she, without meaning to, began to collect them. It was during a late afternoon session, when the city's lights slanted long and golden through the conference windows, that the first real crack appeared in the polished surface of their routine. The project had grown into something larger than anyone anticipated, with investors waiting, deadlines looming, and voices in the room rising sharper than usual. Maya translated Anton's measured responses, softening words where anger tried to harden them, but she could feel the current shifting. A senior director dismissed her mid-sentence, speaking over her hands as though language itself could be bulldozed. Anton's face tightened, and Maya paused, unsure if correcting the dismissal would draw fire or dignity. Before she could decide, Ethan leaned forward. His voice was low, but carried through the room with the certainty of stone. "We don't interrupt the person holding the bridge." He didn't look at the director. He looked at Maya, anchoring her. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but it was the kind of discomfort that pries open a space for change. She steadied her breath, finished the translation, and watched Anton's gratitude flicker across his eyes. The meeting continued, but the air had shifted. Respect had been quietly demanded, and it had stayed. Afterward, the director confronted her in the hallway, his words dressed in corporate politeness, but edged with resentment. "Careful," he said, "about how visible you make yourself. Not everyone here appreciates extras." Maya nodded without replying, though inside her chest a storm was gathering. She returned to her desk with trembling hands, wondering if kindness always came with a cost. But before doubt could root itself, Ethan appeared beside her station. He didn't ask what had been said. He didn't need to. He simply rested a folder on her desk, one that bore her name and the heading Expanded Role Proposal. "This belongs to you," he said quietly, and walked away before she could argue. That night, she carried the folder home like a fragile secret. Inside were notes on a potential new position, Liaison for Accessibility and Inclusion, outlined in Ethan's handwriting, practical yet deliberate. The words blurred as her eyes filled. She thought of Jesse, of his hands learning to shape more and love in the hospital light, and whispered aloud into the quiet of her apartment, "You see me, don't you?" Healing swelled in her chest, bittersweet and undeniable. Days turned into longer nights, and the tension at work deepened. Whispers followed her steps, the supervisor's glances sharpened, and the unspoken question hung in every corner. Why was the CEO giving this intern so much attention? The rumors weren't cruel in detail, but they carried the sting of suspicion, and suspicion can be more isolating than outright hostility. Maya felt the chill of it on her skin, but she also felt Ethan's steadying presence. When others looked at her with calculation, he looked at her with a steadiness that healed. The moment of fracture came during a high-profile event in the atrium. Investors, press, and community leaders had gathered, and Anton was meant to deliver a keynote with Maya by his side. The room glittered with staged perfection, lights polished, glass walls gleaming, cameras poised to capture triumph. But halfway through, the supervisor stepped forward uninvited, intercepting Maya's translation with a substitute interpreter hastily arranged, claiming it was protocol for official events. The words landed like a dismissal, stripping away the role Maya had carved from silence. She froze, hands falling still at her sides, her heart slamming against her ribs. Anton hesitated, looking at her in confusion, then at the stranger fumbling to catch his cadence. The room murmured with unease. For a breath, Maya considered leaving, to walk out, to let the humiliation have her. But Ethan moved. He crossed the stage with a calm that demanded attention, took the microphone and said, "This company does not silence the voice that made this moment possible." His words rang out, not polished for press, but raw with conviction. He turned to Maya. "Stay," he said, not as a command, but as a promise. The cameras caught it, the room felt it. She lifted her hands again, breath trembling, and resumed the translation. The relief that filled Anton's face was mirrored in the crowd's applause when he finished. The fallout was immediate. Whispers turned into articles, headlines questioning favoritism, critics framing the moment as theatre. HR scheduled urgent reviews, and the supervisor's resentment sharpened into open hostility. But something inside Maya had shifted. She no longer felt like a fragile intern clutching at survival. She felt like someone standing at the center of her own vow, to never let silence erase dignity. That night, Ethan found her on the rooftop garden, where the city's skyline stretched like 1,000 lanterns against the dark. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, fighting the weight of everything: rumors, ambition, fear. He approached without sound, then stopped a step away, giving her space. "You were extraordinary," he said simply. "They think I don't belong," she whispered. "They're wrong," he answered, steady. And if you let them, they'll write your story for you. Don't give them the pen." She turned to him, the night wind tangling her hair, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this for me?" "Because you remind me what listening is for," he said. Then softer, "Because I don't want to go back to the man I was before you." The words broke something open in her. She didn't step into his arms, not yet, but she let herself breathe in his presence, let herself believe that maybe this bond wasn't a weakness, but a form of healing both of them needed. The rooftop lights glowed like quiet stars around them, and for the first time she didn't feel like she had to choose between invisibility and survival. She felt like she was allowed to exist fully as herself, and that was the most romantic gift anyone had ever given her. The city hummed beneath their feet, the world still demanding, still unkind. But in that suspended moment, with his gaze holding hers steady, she felt the shape of a future curling toward them, uncertain, fragile, but luminous. And when he finally stepped closer, leaving just enough space for her to decide, she didn't retreat. Healing had led them here, and love, though unspoken, had already begun its quiet work. The city's winter crept in softly, brushing the glass walls of the building with pale light. But inside, the air had become heavier. Rumors were no longer whispers, they had grown teeth. Some carried them like secrets to trade, others held them like shields to protect their own ambitions. The supervisor sharpened every meeting into a quiet trial, every agenda item into a subtle trap. And though Maya kept her composure, her heart often felt like a bird pressed against invisible glass, beating fast, searching for air. Yet in the midst of the pressure, the bond between her and Ethan deepened into something that even doubt could not unthread. They rarely spoke of it directly. There were no declarations, no clumsy confessions. Instead, it unfolded in gestures that carried the weight of words unspoken. When Ethan walked into a room, his gaze found hers first, not to claim, but to steady. When her hands trembled from exhaustion, his voice slowed so she could catch every word without rush. When silence threatened to become loneliness, he filled it with presence, the kind of companionship that reminded her she was not standing alone. Healing, she realized, was not always about erasing scars. Sometimes it was about finding someone who knew how to rest their hand gently over them. One evening, after a long day of negotiations that left the entire executive team frayed, Ethan asked her to join him in the unfinished community space once more. The construction had progressed. Walls now carried color, furniture waited under protective covers, and the faint scent of wood lingered in the air. He walked with her slowly through the room, pointing out details that had been added. Benches curved to face one another, lighting softened to embrace instead of glare. Windows lowered so children or those seated could still see the city. "This place is almost ready," he said. His voice carried that quiet pride that was more about people than projects. "It feels different already," Maya answered. She touched the curve of a bench, imagining the countless conversations it would one day hold. "It feels like it's listening." He smiled at that, then paused by a wall where the paint still waited for a mural. "I want this space to speak in all languages," he said, and then turned to her. "Will you help choose what goes here?" The question pressed warmth into her chest, not because he needed her approval, but because he wanted her vision. She nodded, her throat tight, and whispered, "Yes." They lingered there as dusk fell, and the city lights began their slow, patient glow. Maya thought of Jesse, of how he would have run his small hands along these walls, how his laughter would have filled this echoing space. She felt tears press at the corners of her eyes, not sharp, but gentle, the kind that come when grief finds a safe place to breathe. Ethan noticed, but he didn't ask. He simply stood close enough that she could feel steadiness radiating from him like quiet heat. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I feel like I'm building this for him too, like I'm keeping my promise." "You are," Ethan replied, "and for everyone else who hasn't had a place like this before." His eyes held hers, unflinching, and then he lifted his hand, not confidently, not perfectly, but with care. Slowly, he formed the sign she had taught him. Hope. Her breath caught. The sign was halting, but it was real, and it landed inside her like sunlight through glass. She smiled through the blur of her tears and signed it back to him. In that exchange, something sacred settled between them, fragile but unshakable. Later that night, when they left the building together, the cold air wrapped around them, crisp and cleansing. They walked without hurry, the city alive with its 1,000 untold stories. At a crosswalk the light washed them in red, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still. She looked up at him, and he down at her, and though no words were spoken, the silence was rich with everything they both already knew, but weren't ready to name aloud. The days that followed tested them further. A leaked memo accused Ethan of favoritism, twisting his defense of her during the event into evidence of bias. Headlines sprouted like weeds, framing her as the center of a controversy she had never sought. HR meetings multiplied. The supervisor's voice grew sharper. Allies were cautious with their kindness. Yet even as the storm gathered, Maya felt less fragile than before. She carried Ethan's sign of hope inside her, a reminder that storms are weather, not destiny. On one particularly heavy afternoon, when her name was once again passed around like a caution, Maya found herself in the rooftop garden, clutching her notebook. She opened to a page she had left blank for weeks and finally wrote the words that had been waiting. "I am not a mistake for choosing kindness." She closed her eyes, letting the healing truth of it settle into her bones. When she opened them again, Ethan was there, standing just at the edge of her view, careful not to intrude. He approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her without a word, and sat on the bench across from her, giving her the dignity of space. They drank in silence for a while, the city humming below, the garden leaves rustling like gentle applause. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady. "Storms pass. What stays is what you build in the middle of them." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "And what if what I build isn't enough?" He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "It already is. You are." The words entered her like healing, like breath after holding too long. She felt warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to believe she could stay whole through the storm. The night deepened. The city stretched luminous, and though the battles ahead were far from over, Maya and Ethan sat together under the quiet canopy of sky, knowing they were no longer just fighting to survive the politics of a building. They were learning how to keep each other's hearts intact. And as she closed her notebook, sliding it gently into her bag, she felt a new certainty. Whatever trials awaited, Their bond would not be undone by rumor or fear. It had been built in silence, carried in signs, and anchored in a healing that the world could not take away. The next chapter was waiting, its edges already glowing, and they would walk into it together. Winter loosened its hold, and the first breaths of spring softened the city. The glass atrium filled with brighter light, and for the first time in months people lingered near the windows as if their own hearts had been waiting for warmth. Maya felt it too, an almost imperceptible shift, as though the days themselves were whispering that survival was no longer enough. She walked with steadier steps, her notebook no longer a shield, but a companion. Yet with that light came new shadows, and the conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface finally pressed its way into the open. The supervisor had grown sharper, her words cloaked in civility, but her eyes restless with resentment. In meetings, she questioned Maya's competence, her presence, her right to occupy space that was once invisible. She framed her doubts in professional terms, efficiency, chain of command, but everyone in the room heard the subtext. And each time Ethan defended Maya with his calm precision, the whispers outside grew louder. Why does he protect her? What does she mean to him? Maya bore the weight with quiet grace, but inside she felt torn. The bond she shared with Ethan had become undeniable, yet it placed them both under fire. She feared being the reason his reputation cracked, feared that every glance, every kindness exchanged between them was ammunition in someone else's hands. More than once she considered stepping away, not because her feelings had faded, but because they had grown so strong that she wanted to shield him from their cost. But each time she drifted toward retreat, Ethan's steady gaze pulled her back. He had a way of reminding her, without a single word, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stay. Their closeness deepened in moments no one else saw. Late nights in the community space, arranging chairs not just for design but for dignity. Quiet dinners shared in the corner of the cafeteria long after the crowd had gone, where he listened more than he spoke and let her laughter heal the fatigue of the day. Walks through the city after long sessions, where their silence felt like a shared language older than words. Each of these fragments wove a tapestry too intricate to dismiss, too tender to deny. It was during one such evening that Maya finally allowed her heart to open more fully than before. They had been reviewing the final plans for the mural in the community space, a painting of open hands, luminous and welcoming, framed by soft light. Ethan lingered beside her, his tie loosened, his voice weary but alive. "This place will hold people," he said, almost to himself. "It will let them know they matter." Maya touched the edge of the canvas, her fingers gentle. "That's all I ever wanted, for people not to feel invisible." He looked at her then, and something unspoken filled the space between them. His hand hovered near hers, close enough that the warmth reached her skin, but not touching. It was an invitation, not a claim. She turned her palm upward, and in that simple motion they crossed the fragile line they had been circling for weeks. His fingers intertwined with hers, tentative at first, then certain. The world outside continued, cars moving, lights flickering, voices echoing in distant hallways. But in that moment, all that existed was the quiet thrum of two hearts choosing not to retreat. His hand was steady, hers trembling, yet the fit felt inevitable. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself the luxury of peace. Healing washed over her in waves, not because the battles had ended, but because she no longer faced them alone. Still, love, when born in the midst of storms, is tested quickly. The next morning, the headlines sharpened. An article speculated openly about favoritism, naming Maya directly. The language was subtle but cruel, reducing her worth to rumor, painting her presence as scandal. She read the words at her desk, her breath catching, the screen blurring. For a moment, she felt the old fear return, that she was nothing more than an intruder, a mistake that had slipped through the cracks. But when she looked up, Ethan was there. He didn't speak across the room, didn't make a show. He simply stepped beside her, placed a folded piece of paper on her notebook, and walked away to his next meeting. When she unfolded it, she found only a single sentence written in his deliberate hand: "They will not define you. You already are enough." Her throat tightened, and for the first time that day, she let herself breathe deeply, letting the words anchor her. That night, she found him in the rooftop garden, where the city spread out like a constellation, and though no one else would ever hear it, she whispered the truth that had been waiting in her chest. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice low. "So am I," he admitted. Then he turned to her fully, his eyes carrying both resolve and vulnerability. "But fear means this matters. And what matters is worth standing for." The simplicity of it healed something raw inside her. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the steady rhythm of his breath, close enough that the distance between them finally surrendered. His arms came around her, not in possession, but in promise, and she let her head rest against his chest. The city lights flickered like a quiet choir, bearing witness as two people, battered by doubt, found refuge in each other. They didn't speak of love that night. They didn't need to. The word was already living in the way they held on, in the way his hand pressed gently against her back, as if to say, "I'm here," in the way her tears fell without shame, because she knew he would catch them. Healing had always been a part of their story, but now it had blossomed into something deeper. Love not as a sudden fire, but as a steady flame that endured against the wind. When dawn came, they stood together, watching the horizon soften with light. The battles were not gone. Rumors would sharpen, politics would play their games, choices would demand courage. But standing side by side, they understood something vital. The storm could rage as loud as it wished, but it could not take from them the truth they now carried. They had found one another, not in perfection, but in persistence, not in silence, but in the language of healing. And as they left the rooftop, walking back into the uncertain day, their hands brushed once more. This time, neither of them pulled away. The future was unwritten, but the bond was already inked. What awaited them would test their strength, but it would also reveal the depth of what they were becoming. Two lives learning, slowly and bravely, how to be whole together. Spring melted into early summer, and the city carried with it the sound of renewal. Trees softening into green, windows opening to let in air that smelled of beginnings. The building, too, seemed to breathe differently. The community space was finally unveiled, light pouring across its walls, the mural complete, a symphony of hands and colors that spoke to everyone who entered. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a declaration. Maya walked through it one morning before the official launch, fingertips grazing the curve of a bench, and felt Jessie's presence there like a blessing. Healing radiated from the walls, not as decoration, but as truth. No one here would be invisible again. The event drew a crowd of journalists, investors, and community leaders. Cameras clicked, microphones angled forward, voices hummed with anticipation. Maya stood at the side, heart steady but quickened, knowing the storm of the past months had led to this moment. Ethan entered the space, his presence commanding but not domineering, dressed simply, yet carrying that unmistakable air of someone who believed in what he was about to say. His eyes found hers briefly, one heartbeat of recognition, and she felt her courage root itself deeper. He began by speaking not of profits or projections, but of people. He spoke of the overlooked, the unheard, the forgotten. He spoke of language not as barrier, but as bridge, of silence not as exile, but as another form of song. Then he gestured to Maya and asked her to stand with him. The crowd shifted, curious, their eyes sharp with the memory of rumors. But she walked forward anyway, notebook pressed to her side, chin lifted. Ethan turned to her as though she were the only person in the room. "This," he said, "is Maya. Without her, this project would not exist. She taught us to listen when it would have been easier to speak over. She reminded us that leadership is not about volume, but about presence. Today, this space belongs not to me, but to everyone she represents, the voices we cannot afford to silence." Maya's throat tightened as she signed his words for Anton, who stood proudly nearby, his face radiant with quiet triumph. For a moment, the world seemed to balance on her hands, meaning flowing through her fingers like light. The applause that followed was not polite, but thunderous, rising from a place deeper than expectation. It felt like recognition, not just of her, but of the dignity she had carried into every room. In the aftermath, articles were written, but the tone had changed. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was admiration. Where there had been whispers of favoritism, now there were headlines about transformation. People spoke of courage, of inclusion, of healing, reshaping an institution. And though not every voice was kind, Maya no longer measured herself by their approval. She carried her worth within her, anchored by a bond that rumors could not erode. Privately, she and Ethan found their moments outside the spotlight. Long evenings in the rooftop garden, where the air was scented with summer jasmine and the city pulsed like a living heart below. Shared breakfasts in quiet corners before the day unfolded, laughter soft and unguarded. Walks through neighborhoods where no one knew their names, where they were simply two souls weaving their steps together. The romance between them was not a blaze demanding attention, but a steady flame, healing and warm, burning with the quiet strength of something true. Yet love, once acknowledged, does not stand still. One night, under the soft glow of rooftop lights, Ethan took her hand and spoke words that had been living in his chest. "You've given me more than I knew I needed. Not just hope, not just change, something gentler. You've given me yourself, and I don't take that lightly. I want to keep building this, Maya, not just spaces for others, but a life with you." Tears filled her eyes, but they were not heavy tears. They were cleansing, like rain that softens parched ground. She answered not with hesitation, but with certainty. "Yes." And in that moment, the world seemed to pause, as though the city itself leaned in to listen. They kissed, not with urgency, but with the tenderness of two people who had already chosen each other long before their lips ever met. From then on, the days carried a new rhythm. Work continued, challenges persisted, but beneath it all was a current of love that steadied them both. Healing was no longer a destination, but a companion, guiding them through each storm, reminding them that to be seen, to be held, and to be loved was enough. Maya found herself laughing more, daring more, and dreaming of a future that once had felt impossible. And Ethan, once a man defined by silence and control, became someone who allowed himself to be vulnerable, to speak not only with authority but with heart. Together, they learned that love was not an interruption to their lives. It was the language that had been waiting all along. The mural in the community space became a symbol for the company and beyond. Visitors would pause before it, tracing the painted hands, whispering their own stories into its colors. And each time Maya passed it, she smiled, knowing it was not just art, but a vow that people, in all their voices and silences, deserved to be honored. It was Jessie's legacy, her legacy, their legacy together. As summer deepened, they stood once more in that space, side by side, watching a group of children run across the room, their laughter ringing against the walls. Ethan leaned close and whispered, "This is what forever should feel like." And Maya, with a heart both healed and healing still, believed him. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt even a spark of healing in these words, let it linger a little longer. Leave a comment to share your thoughts so that stories like this can ripple out to others who may need them. Gently tap the like button. Subscribe if you wish to walk further with me through more tales of love and resilience, and share this with someone who deserves a moment of warmth. Every gesture you give is a light carried forward, and together those lights can make the world feel less lonely, more seen, more whole.